The implementation we are going to show you is in Greenfoot, but you can ignore that. Imagine something like that in your own favorite IDE and think about whether you think it might be a good idea in your context. The whole problem with editing is that it is based on a technology that was developed half a century ago. We are editing text, and that is the heart of the problem. That alone describes the source of all the evils we think we discover here. The problem is that the unit of manipulation in your IDE is a single character. You can edit in your IDE every character individually. You can select a character, you can insert a character, you can delete a character. That is technology, that was developed in those times. Why are we doing this? Well, in those times, there was nothing else available. It was a natural thing to do. That was all you had. Now we have all the processing power we want. We have color displays. We have graphical displays. We can actually now technically do a lot more than just stare at raw characters. And we have to ask ourselves, are sequences of characters really the best representation for those things we try to show? What you actually want to do when you're writing a program is you want to manipulate program constructs. You want to create, change, manipulate, insert, delete statements and expressions of your language. When you think about your program, in your mind, logically, those are the atomic units of your manipulation. And your IDE forces you down to the level of single characters. And I will show you in a moment why that is a problem and how we could do better. Now, you might well say, well, my IDE does a lot of wonderful things, and my text editor actually did get a lot better over the last 10 years. We have now auto layout, we have code completion, we have continuous compilation with inline error notifications, we've got hints, and we've got... So a lot of things have changed. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we didn't have those things. But even though these functionalities address the right problem, I think the designers of the IDEs have recognized the problems. We think they are not the optimal solution. You can do a lot better than that if you get away from pure text as the representation of your program. With what we're going to show you, I think we can make improvements in all the areas of programming. That is, the presentation of your program, readability. We think we can actually make it look nicer, and nicer not just in an emotional, subjective way, but actually reading to better readability, and through better readability, better understandability, fewer errors. We think we can improve the entry of programs by making it actually faster to enter your program than you can do it now. And we think we can improve the manipulation of programs so that when you have to do changes, refactorings, edits, that you benefit from that as well. We have very few slides. That was pretty much it already. We will spend the rest of the time doing a demo. I think you understand much better, and it's much more interesting if I just show you what we've done. So here is Greenfoot, and the Greenfoot IDE has always a graphical sort of area here that we call the world. That is actually completely uninteresting for this talk. This is just some random sample application I've chosen so that I have some program text. That's a predator-prey simulation, actually, where the blue things eat the yellow things. But what I will not talk about that anymore, but what I want to look at is actually really only the editor. This is what the editor looks like. Here's one very simple class. Actually, just to concentrate your mind, I'll make that the only window that I have open here. So this is the presentation of a program in our language. The language is very much like Java with very minor differences. You see that we got rid of curly brackets and semicolons, but otherwise it is a very much a Java-like language, and the principles I'm talking about you could apply to straight Java or to any other programming language. The actual language is not that relevant. So the first thing you see is that we are using colors and graphical elements such as these boxes here on the screen. So a scope, for example, is now represented by what we call a frame, a graphical box. That is a very simple, but once you think about it, quite obvious thing to do. Some programming language constructs, including, for example, scope, is much better and much more clearly presented by a graphical element than by a pair of characters. You know, you can have a curly brace here, and you can have a curly brace somewhere down there. In fact, you probably have 15 curly brackets somewhere down there, and you somehow have to work out which one matches which one. And what IDEs typically do is they do some auto-indentation to try to line them up so that you can see it more easily. But still, it is a lot more work. Now, it is visually and mentally, especially when the beginning or the end of the scope is out of view, it is much harder to see. Here, when you look at these boxes, you know, if they are half in view, you see pretty much exactly that this scope here extends down beyond your current view, and this one doesn't. It is much more immediate. So that is what I mean with saying, you know, forget about just using characters for everything. You have much more at your disposal now. You can make your program presentation much nicer if you just are prepared to drop the idea that everything has to be presented by characters. We obviously, as you can see already, we use color for some things. In our case, different kinds of constructs are represented by different color. The class background is green, methods are yellow. So here you can see very clearly immediately where the methods are. If statements have a color, loops have a color, and so on. So you get quite used to these colors fairly quickly. Once you work with this for a few weeks, you identify constructs very quickly by color without any effort. It just happens automatically. If you see red, you know there's a loop. You don't actually have to read the detail of the program text anymore. The next thing, apart from presentation, is the insertion of statement. If I want to insert a statement, I hit a single key, for example, an equals key, and I get an assignment statement, and I can fill it in. I hit another key, and I get an if statement. So a single command key inserts a complete statement. And if I want a loop, I hit one key, I get a while loop. These keys you learn fairly quickly. There aren't actually all that many. Once you think about, you know, how many constructs you can insert at any point in your program, it's usually less than a dozen. You know them quite quickly. And the point is, a lot of syntax errors are avoided here. You know, you cannot have an if statement where the closing bracket is missing. In fact, when you think about it, it doesn't even make sense why your programming IDE, your programming environment, lets you enter half a statement. Why would you ever want to have half a statement? Either you want a statement or you don't. You know, the reason that is possible is pure accident of history because it needed to be represented by multiple characters. So normally you are responsible for choosing which statement you want, then you have to type it, and typing it means typing out the keyword. You actually have to type every character. Okay, some IDEs then use a bit of completion and try to make that a bit easier for you, and that means the designers of the IDE have recognized the problem. They know it's annoying to have to type it all out, but they have a solution that is only half as good as it can be. And you are responsible as a programmer for the punctuation. You have to, make sure that the semicolons, the brackets are all there. Even if your IDE puts it in automatically for you, in a traditional IDE, you can still mess it up afterwards. You can still delete a bracket without deleting the other bracket. Why is that even possible? And then you are also responsible for presentation. You're responsible for layout. The indentation is under your control. Of course, your IDE tries to keep you on the right path and tries to sort of lay it out correctly, but I can mess it up. I can delete some spaces in front of the statement. And believe me, if you work in teaching, your students do. They never get it right. Layout of a program, it's a simple algorithm. Why does the programmer actually have to do anything about it? Why can the programmer actually make it wrong? There is no reason. What you actually want to do is you want to think about your program structure. You want to think about what kind of statement you want to have where, and the rest you can automate. The presentation, the showing of the keyword, the generation of the actual keyword, the punctuation, the indentation, it can all be taken away from you and it can be automated. So, We can insert statements, and of course we can also insert methods. If I go here, I hit a key, I get a method. I can type a name, I can insert some statements here. And it is all fairly quick. You have a single key to insert the statement frame, and then you have what we call slots. Slots are these white things here where you then fill in the details. For an if statement, for example, you have one slot for the condition, one slot for the body. And of course there you fill in your details, and that is what you actually want to concentrate on because that is the important thing. One of the side effects also of using graphics is you can elevate statements, program statements, to become first-class entities in your user interface. In a user interface of your traditional IDE, you have a text pane, that's your interface element, and then you have characters, and there's nothing in between. And here, because it is an interface element, I can just grab it and move it somewhere else. I can grab this statement and move it here. These statements, they now become entities. They can be moved around. They can be manipulated as one object. Of course, you might say, well, my IDE also has drag and drop. If you use Eclipse or NetBeans or IntelliJ or Visual or any of the big IDEs, yes, you have drag and drop in your text editor, but first of all, selecting the text is quite a high effort, manipulation interaction, because you have to target very precisely. You have to target the exact right characters. In fact, little details such as whether you include the trailing new line or not in your selection make a difference, because when you drop it somewhere, it messes up your indentation if you get it wrong. And that is quite fiddly. That is, so you fiddle with mouse selection while you actually want to think about your program structure. And here, I can grab this anywhere and drop it not anywhere. That is also another thing. In your text IDE, you can drop any selected text anywhere. You can take a statement, select it, and drop it into the middle of a keyword. Why? Why is that ever sensible? When you move statements around, 95% of the locations in your text editor are invalid. Why does your editor actually let you do this? Here, I can drag the statement only where it's actually syntactically valid. If I try to put it outside of the method, it tells me it doesn't work. And it offers me only locations that are actually valid, where the syntax tree remains intact or remains valid. So your IDE knows exactly where it can go. Why does it not help you with putting it where it can go? And that now, hopefully, you start to understand what I mean with it is a mistake to manipulate your program at the level of individual characters. Characters individually have no meaning. You want to manipulate statements. You want to manipulate, your program language constructs. So drag and drop becomes a really easy, quick, low overhead operation. You can select statements also with a keyboard. I just did the drag and drop with the mouse. You don't have to touch the mouse. This whole editor, even though it uses graphical elements, can be driven entirely with a keyboard. So it was important as we know, we are programmers ourselves, you don't really want to take your hands off the keyboard. Once you know your editor well, you're much faster with the keyboard and the mouse. We can do everything with the keyboard. You have, in addition, mouse-based drag and drop operations, but you don't need to use them. We have selection, so I can select a statement or a group of statements. If I have a group of statements, I can drag them together if I want to. One other thing I can do, if I have a selection and then I insert an if statement, I'm actually surrounding that statement with my if statement. So some simple operations like that become much easier in the user interface, and they become much easier to implement. I can delete statements. I can delete that if statement here, or I could delete that if statement including the body from here. I can do that with keys. I can also do that with mouse if I want to. I have a right click on my statements. As I told you, they are first-class interface elements, so of course they have a context menu, and there I have, for example, a delete of the whole statement or a delete of just the outer frame of the statement, leaving the body intact. Just there are sort of common operations that you would want that you can much more easily offer once you can offer a right-click menu, because you have a representation of your statement. One thing that goes away completely, which is a sort of permanent, sort of ongoing gripe in big teams, is layout and presentation. You know, the layout here, it's not your problem anymore. You know, you can forget all the, you know, debates about, are we indenting 4 spaces or 2 or 3 or 8? You know, what is the God-given right number of spaces for indentation? This is all automated. And in fact, if you like a small indent and your other colleague likes, you know, the 8-space indentation, and you think that's crazy, you can both have your way, because the amount that this is indented here can be just a preference setting in your installation of your editor. Changing indentation does not change your source code anymore. You know, it's, if someone changes the indentation, that's just a visual preference of your particular presentation that you're looking at the moment. It's an attribute of your editor, not of your program anymore. Indentation has nothing to do in program text. It's not program structure, and it's crazy that just because someone wants their indentation to be different because they like different colors, or you know, that changes your program source, and then it messes up your versioning. You know, if someone changes the layout of something, someone uses another IDE that uses different default layout, suddenly you get lots of conflicts in your, or at least changes in your version repository. You know, it is completely nonsensical. Also, screen size. Now, if I, for example, let's say, oops, I'm closed it instead of selecting it. Let me just open that again, because I've got a class here that has a few sort of longer statements here. If I've got long statements and I have a very narrow screen, wrapping lines is done automatically. And you can debate whether this kind of indent with the wrapping looks nice or not. If you don't like it, write a different layout algorithm in your own editor. But that is automated. No, it's not in the program text. So if someone has a really narrow screen, you know, because they work on their sort of little tablet thing, or they like to have, you know, 15 windows next to each other open on their screen, and you have a really wide screen, you don't have to dictate anymore that, you know, everyone should use only 80 characters width because someone doesn't like long lines. And every time, you know, you indent a line differently, it changes your repository again. Wrapping is completely under control of the presentation system. It does not change the program text, and it shouldn't. So layout is automatic. Some layout is also adaptive. So if I insert a variable here, and you see our variables have the var keyword. If I insert another variable underneath, then the second line, the second variable, does not get the var keyword at the beginning, because it knows that there is a variable declaration block here already, and so visually it's a little bit lighter. You know, so it can adapt. Or if you have a loop somewhere, and somewhere here you have a break, I insert a break of the loop, that break can indicate with color and with a graphical element exactly which loop it is breaking out of. You know, so once you start thinking in terms of graphics for presentation, there's a lot you can do. Okay, I'll hand over here to Neil, who will show you some of the other goodies in our editor.
Thank you. So Michael has given you a sort of overview there of the general structure of the editor and how we're using these frames as our sort of first-class interface elements. What I'm going to show you next is just more of the sort of lower level stuff. So we could take that sort of frames idea all the way down and have frames in expressions and things like that. But it tends to get very fiddly and annoying if you do that. We were sort of experimenting with our prototypes. But ultimately, when you get down to the expression level, you do just want to be able to type and just have sort of fairly standard text editing capability. So here I've got my if frame that I've just created. I'm in the condition, and if I want to just have some expression in there, I can just type, you know, 1 + 2 + 3. There's no sort of special command keys once you get down to the expression level. You're just typing expressions like you would sort of in your usual IDE. But there's just a couple of improvements we've made on top of that. So for example, one difference when you enter the expressions is, so I just typed there literally 1 plus 2 plus 3 were the only keys that I touched, and yet I actually have space between my operators. So this spacing here is again a graphical element, so we automatically add space around the operators. Again, you could have this user configured if different people like different amounts of spacing around your operator, but you don't actually have to touch the space key to insert a space character between them. You can't have sort of runs of spacing between them, which means, so it's easier and it's faster. So if you never have to touch the space bar while you're entering an expression, you are bound to be faster entering that expression than somebody that is putting the spaces in manually. The sort of theoretical limit on speed of program entry is the number of keys you have to press. I mean, we've known that for ages, you know, VI and Emacs and all these sort of crazy key combinations. They're all about trying to minimize the amount of key presses that you have to make to enter or manipulate your code. So we're again looking for places where you can just sort of take out unneeded effort, in this case pressing the space bar, in order to make entering your program faster. And then from there, that sort of spins off into other ideas. So we've got 1 plus 2 plus 3, but if I take that back and make it 1 plus 2 times 3, we actually dynamically respace the operators based on their precedence. So tighter binding operators get less space between them. The sort of lower binding operators actually get more space between them. Some programmers actually sort of obey this rule with space characters sometimes by sort of putting more space between the ones that are binding less tightly. So obviously you can use brackets and, you know, make it unambiguous, and generally programmers sort of learn their precedence rules anyway, but it's just a tiny presentation difference, just to give an indication here, okay, the 2 times 3 is one thing, and the 1 plus, you know, is sort of less tightly bound. It doesn't go sort of all the way down. We've got sort of 3 spacing levels, but if, for example, you then put the equality operator in there, that's even lower precedence, so that gets further spacing around it. So we've sort of got 3 tiers of spacing that we dynamically add. And so generally in the keyboard entry, we're trying to not get in the way of what you're used to doing while you're editing. So as I said there, while you don't have to press the space bar, if you do press the space bar, we don't get in your face about it, we just ignore it. So space bar just is sort of a no-op while you're editing the code. And similarly here, if you want to insert an assignment frame here, so you then might fill in the left-hand side with a particular variable name, then you want to sort of get over to the right-hand side. So obviously, as you might expect, the left and right cursor keys just, you know, move across the positions. But obviously what you're used to typing if you're writing Java is x equals. So if you type that equals, you just automatically overtype the equals that's there and move into the other side. So you can type basically Java as you're used to, and it still fits in perfectly with our editing style. You know, we're programmers as well, we're using this. It gets really irritating if somehow what you're used to typing, you know, in your other editor when you're developing suddenly wouldn't work in this. So similarly, if you insert a method call here, we automatically put the brackets in for you. But once you get to the end there, again, if you just type opening bracket there, you just overtype the assistance that's already there. Some IDEs do this when they sort of fill in templating. You kind of end up overtyping the structure that's there. But we didn't want you to accidentally insert another set of brackets before that, and it gets all sort of irritating. So although we're providing editing help and sort of structure, once you get down to the expression level, you can just basically type Java, and once you hit the end, so again, here you can type the closing bracket, and I believe as well, oh no, you can put the semicolon in. I think that's on our to-do list, is we just ignore the semicolons that you put in as well. You'll notice that you don't need any semicolons in this editor because, you know, the line ending is all integrated already into the structure. So again, if you never have to type semicolons, you're again saving key presses, potentially saving time on the entry of your code, and you can't mess up the semicolons and get them wrong. Or do what a lot of beginners do, which is put a semicolon at the end of the if header just there. I don't know if any of you have ever done that by accident, but it's a really difficult bug to track down, because what that does is the semicolon forms an empty body of your if, and all of a sudden your if condition has no effect. Professionals tend not to do it, beginners do it a lot, and it's really sort of pernicious error. So we're sort of, as on the education side, we want to eliminate the possibility to make these kind of stupid errors that, you know, nobody is really looking to make. And so by sort of doing it in this structured way, we can actually avoid a lot of those errors.
Once you've typed the equal sign to start a assignment frame, if you
Yeah, so it's a good question. The question was, okay, we've got this distinction up front between writing a method call and writing an assignment. What if you change your mind? Is it really irritating to back out of that and change the other one? And the answer is, especially in that particular case, no. So if you want to insert a method call, click there, on the right-hand side, obviously you can then just sort of type the method call, but you then might decide, okay, I don't actually even want to store the result of that method, I just want a plain method call. As you suggested, you just backspace and delete the assignment. It changes between them. If you then decide, oh, actually I do want that back, just typing that assignment operator switches between the two. So we just make it very natural to change between the two. That's a particularly common case. Things like changing an if to a while, you actually very rarely want to do. We had some functionality in that originally. So, okay, you've got an if and you want to turn it into a while. I don't do that very often while I'm programming. I don't know about you guys, but there's very little time where you actually want to sort of change the overall container construct. But there are sort of easier ways to do it. So if you, so let's say, for example, you've got this if here and you've decided, okay, I want to scrap that and turn it into a while. You can always just delete the if, select them, and use the while shortcut key to get back. So it's not, you know, crazily difficult if you do want to change between those constructs.
But one additional answer to that is any frame you insert, after you insert the frame, a backspace type straightly after will remove that frame again. So you can always back out of any accidental insertion with a backspace key.
Yeah, or the escape key for that matter. So if you accidentally press an insert and you didn't want it, just escape will back it out. Okay, so another example where we sort of have structure in our editors and also the overtyping is you might, for example, want to add the parameter to a method. So of course we all know formal parameters need a type and a name, and so we have these two different slots here, one ready for the type and one for the name. So if I put an int, again, if you're used to sort of Java editing behavior, you want to press space there. And since we're generally ignoring space in a lot of slots anyway, space is just a navigation key that pushes you over to the next item, so you can just type as you're used to. You then put in the name of the parameter, and if you want to add another one, well, if you were typing in Java, you'd just type a comma, and so typing a comma here is just adding sort of extra structure, and then you can add the extra parameter. Or if you decide, oh, actually I didn't want this one anyway, you can just backspace across all of it. And the structure just sort of goes, you know, as you type. So we're trying not to be really annoying to sort of actually create and manipulate the structure. We're trying sort of hard to fit in with your standard editing behaviors. So that if we took a programmer who's used to a text editor and put them in this, there's a little bit of upfront learning to actually learn, you know, for example, the couple of shortcut keys to insert the initial frame. But actually, while you're just sort of typing and you've got this muscle memory and you're not even thinking about it, what you type should just work in, you know, sort of 90–95% of cases. You don't actually need to adjust your behavior, but hopefully you can get faster as you kind of learn some of the tricks in the new editor. So another feature we have is code completion, of course. You know, we all use code completion a lot in our IDEs, I'm sure. So if you're, you know, you make your method frame and you want code completion, control space, of course, just loads up the code completion. In general, it's pretty similar to a lot of IDEs. You know, it's a pretty good system that we use often. So you can just, you know, type in your method, your sort of suggestion, and it will show up. Both the ones that start with that prefix, and it will also it gives you related suggestions, which come up in two ways. It either looks for an infix search, basically, so you know it's looking for MO within these method names. But it also potentially looks for typos. So if you accidentally type T rather than V for the next one, there's no methods available in our system that begin MOT, but there are a lot that begin MO something if you didn't mean to hit that T. Obviously, the further away you get, you know, it's a limited edit distance system. But we at least protect against a single typo, so that if you made one mistake in there, you know, it shows you some nearby methods that you might have meant instead. The code completion is also contextual. So one advantage of our system that a lot of IDEs try and replicate, but it's easier here, is to know what context are you in at the moment. So if I'm here, I know that I'm in a method call context, and I just show method call names in this particular zone. Whereas up here, if I go back to my parameters, in this slot, I'm in a type context. And I know that immediately because of the sort of structure in the system. In an IDE, you can try and work that out by looking at tokens around, but you're having to kind of pass halfway sort of structured code that might be incomplete or have errors. But for us, I can just hit control space there, and what I get is a list of type completions. No method names are shown because they're not valid here. So then I can just select my sort of int type from the list and finish it off. So we get a lot of context information for free from the structure, which we could use to kind of be more intelligent in what we're suggesting you. So, for example, the types and method completions. Okay, so there was a paper written a few years ago that looked at habits of programmers while they were programming. And one sort of, what edits do they make, what functionality do they use? And one interesting finding was programmers don't undo, which I think would make a really good t-shirt slogan, if anyone here does programmer t-shirts. So why don't programmers undo? Well, you can kind of boil undo down into two different things that you might want to undo. So one is that you're a sort of syntactic undo. So you're typing along and you accidentally type that method name wrong. Oh, whoops, I meant to say move. Now, very, very few programmers will use Control-Z or Command-Z at this point to undo that mistake, right? So you either just backspace back to where you were and type it again, or if it's quite far away, you might use the cursor keys, to navigate across to your mistake and actually correct it. But you don't use the actual undo functionality, you just sort of, use your typing. And the other time that you might want to sort of use undo is perhaps what we might think of as a semantic undo. So let's say I'm up here, I maybe think, oh, let's try changing a few of these parameters. I want to see what effect it has in the simulation. So you change a couple of those. Then you're down here and you think, oh, this code, no, I don't need that anymore. That break, no, I'll get rid of that. And then you think, yeah, okay, oh, actually, maybe I didn't want to increase the litter size. Now, if you undo at this point, undo is a linear stack of operations, you're going to undo the edits you did way down there. And you don't generally want to do that. So very often you're trying to undo something that you did a little while ago, but you don't want to undo the edits in between. And I don't know of any IDE that sort of has decent support for that, because it tends to get, it's version control level at that point, isn't it? You've got some change down here you want to preserve and some change up here you want to take back. For us, of course, we can actually narrow the undo scope down to a particular structure. So if I now right-click on this particular thing, if I go to recent values, I get a graphical menu showing the recent states of that particular frame. So if I then click this one, I've then reverted back that particular item back to its previous state, but I haven't had to mess with all the other ones that I did in between. So we can actually have sort of localized undo setting, which makes it much more useful. And so we put it on this particular menu because it also helps sort of see what the previous states are that you might want to go back to. We keep a list of about 3 or 4 of them that you may want to correct.
IntelliJ idea supports that.
Sorry, I'm a bit hard of hearing at the moment, I'm afraid.
IntelliJ has it as well.
Okay. Okay.
One previous value.
Okay.
From the version control.
All right, cool. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the other thing I'm just going to talk about here is some of the display elements. So Michael has shown a couple of these already. For example, the break frame automatically indicates graphically, where it belongs to. There's a few other improvements that we've looked to make to try and sort of provide more context when you're editing your program. And some of this arises, as Michael said, from once you stop thinking about your sort of your program code as a text pane, you start having all these other ideas. We're developing this thing. You could do that now, and you could do this. So, for example, one thing that's often very useful to know when you're editing is which method you're inside, and kind of, if you're in, say, a long if statement or a long while loop, you often want to know, okay, where am I? Basically, what's the context of this code that I'm editing? So to enable that, we make it so that when you actually scroll down, if you look at the top of the screen here, just by this header, once that actually scrolls off the top of the screen, we don't scroll it out of view, we just pin it to the top, okay? This is a simple UI trick that's used a lot on mobile phone displays and that kind of thing, that you just keep the header as you scroll past. And we've just taken that across into the code editor. So you can always see at the top of the screen which method you're editing, and you can see its parameters. And if you scroll further and take an if header out of view, we consider doing exactly the same thing with if and while headers, but they tended to sort of, you tend to get a huge stack at the top of your screen if you're not careful, and the actual edit zone disappears. So we then realized, well, hey, that indent space, nobody's really using that, right? It's just sort of a color band that nothing's going on. So why don't we just draw it in there? So once it scrolls off the top of the screen, again, you can actually just see the context here if you want to. And we try and make it fairly subtle so it doesn't, annoy you and get in the way, but you can just kind of glance across if you actually want to see, okay, which for loop am I inside again? And you can sort of just see it over on the side there. Of course, these things scroll up and, just sort of disappear as you head down the program file. So it's quite a subtle thing that, doesn't sort of annoy you too much, but it's just there as useful information if you actually want to glance across and see it. And I mean, these changes, these couple of sort of visualizations in particular, I think are a good example of our sort of, point that graphical display of program code enables you to do a lot more than kind of, terminal-based display of program code. Maybe with some funky Unicode rotate thing, you could sort of, emulate this in your text editor or something, but you can just do so much more with sort of finer grained spacing, with annotations, with visual display, if you're willing to accept, okay, I work in a GUI, I'm not just sort of working in some facsimile of an 80 by 25 character terminal. So there's a lot more that you can do. And of course, modern IDEs are sort of doing this to a large extent, red squiggly underlines, pop-ups, overlays, that kind of thing. We're just taking it further and thinking, okay, if you completely abandon the requirement to be plain text, what can you do? And so these are some of our ideas. Similarly, if you want to insert, for example, a method call, you'll see we've already got this sort of gray prompt text there reminding you to type a method name. Okay, that's maybe not necessarily so useful for professionals. We aim at beginners, and for them it's actually quite useful to remember what the hell am I putting in here, or the fact that if has a condition. But one thing that is useful is once you type a method that's recognized, the system does dynamic lookup of the methods in the background, it actually copies across the parameter name of your method into that thing, gives you a prompt. If you then mouse over it, it gives you more information. So IDEs have this knowledge, and you can get pop-ups like this often if you hit a shortcut key in your IDE, but we're just automatically giving you that sort of prompt there so that you can see, okay, this takes a distance. And it's just looked up from the method definition. This is not some magic blessed method. We just look up, if you had a method in a jar or whatever, I think jars keep this information on the parameter names, you can actually just sort of display it, so for any available method.
Did I hear you right that happens without user request just pops up?
Yeah.
Oh God, that's horrible. I don't like pop-ups on my web browser, and I hate it in my iPhone.
Oh, sorry, the pop-up, so the pop-up was on mouse over, but the prompt text there, so the distance text was automatic. And that goes away as soon as you fill in a value. It's just while it's empty. But the
This mouse over it is still popping up even though I didn't do anything to ask for it?
yeah, so the mouse over does sort of display this pop-up, but if you don't want it, it's only while it's focused. So if you mouse over the focused field and it's got a particular information, then it shows it. But if you mouse over some other parameter field that hasn't got focus, it doesn't get in your way. So it's only if you've deliberately gone out of your way to move your mouse into the focus field after you've done that. But yeah, I mean...
My hands are not good. My mouse moves all over the place. Where, when, or why, so...
Yeah.
I hope there's some way to turn that off.
Okay. Yeah, certainly, obviously, it's a design decision which we could take differently. It's not a requirement for this particular editor. It's just our choice. And so just to show you one or two final things before we turn it over for some questions. So here, I've been scribbling in this act method, but if I just take it back to what it was to begin with, where there's no parameters, then act is actually a method. So what we've got here in Greenfoot in general, we've got Fox, which back down the class hierarchy extends from actor, and actor is a particular sort of class in our API. And so what you do if you want to sort of have a new actor is you override the act method. And so the fact that this act overrides a method in actor is actually displayed as a little sort of graphical annotation here. So obviously there's a programming language design thing here. Should the system be the ones telling us that we've overridden a method, or should we be the ones telling the system that we've overridden a method, or both, or neither, or whatever? So obviously in Java we use @override, and we tell the system. What we're experimenting here with is just doing it the other way around, to tell the user, oh hey, this thing overrides a method. For our educational purposes, it's especially useful for beginners to explain why is the act method special from their point of view when this is some of the first code they've seen. And the answer is over here, because it overrides a method, and therefore, it has a particular other status. It also is useful because it tells you which class you're overriding from originally. So if you've got a complicated class hierarchy and you override, some add listener method or something like that, it will actually tell you which add listener method you're overriding, what the original base was. And just to show you the final mode. So one thing that is often used in IDEs is things like a sort of overview of your code. So, you've got this other little dockable window that sits on the side, and it shows you a list of all the methods and all the variables that you've got in your code. Now, personally, I tend to either be looking at the main window and kind of doing some editing, or I'm looking at that overlay, usually for navigation. So, I want to okay, what methods were there in my class, and which one do I want to go to? So something we've experimented with here is we thought, okay, let's have some sort of, overlay view. They're kind of useful. And then we thought, well, if I'm mainly looking at one or the other, why not sort of just boil them down to the same one? So if I hit here a particular command, Command D, the code automatically collapses into the overview view. So now I can see all the methods that are listed in my class, up and down, just skip between them. And if I want to jump to another one, I just hit Enter, and I jump back there. Alternatively, if I decide against that and I don't want to sort of hop around, you just press Escape and you're back to where you started. And again, this is something, this animated collapse is something we can do because we're thinking in terms of sort of graphical elements rather than in text. Obviously, this is quite similar to sort of code folding and ideas like that, but it's just trying something a bit different to do with, navigating between things and having this overview of the different sort of methods available. So I'm just going to give a quick summary of some of the sort of key points of this work, and then we'll just hand over to a questions section. So one key thing is that we're separating content from presentation in your code. So in general in programming, we recognize that separating content from presentation is a good idea. As Michael said, why is, the indentation in your file, the placement of the curly braces, all these different things are there in the code when they should be a per sort of client basis. It should be, I like this, you like that, you like that. We don't store it in version control, and yet that's what we've ended up with in programming. So what you've seen here is just serialized into XML, but of course all the spacing is added graphically. So if you want to sort of change the spacing or change the layout or things like that, you can just do that on your client, but the core code is basically stored as the AST, not as this textual representation. So you can, you don't have to argue with other people about how it's laid out. You have different editors behaving differently, and you don't have all these sort of false conflicts and confusing things like that. It also means, of course, that we can present things that are not in the content. So things like the prompt text, we don't actually have to insert that as text in your editor for you to delete, which some sort of IDEs tend to. It's just a graphical element. It's not actually there in the content at all. It's just for your display, and similar with a lot of other things. So it works both ways, this sort of separation. So we also get sort of improved presentation. Okay, you might disagree with the color scheme or particulars of it, but you can see as a general principle that you can customize more sort of what's going on in your code, and especially things like the boxes for scope rather than the curly brackets, we just think make a lot of sense and are just sort of superior to the textual representation. We've also talked about how you can have faster entry. Less key presses required to enter the same code in almost all cases means that you can actually enter your code much faster. You can also manipulate it more easily by having easier selection either with the mouse or with the keyboard to just select chunks of code and move them around. Of course, we've got cut, copy, paste, all the interactions that you'd expect for those frames. And this is all done by making these statements sort of first-class components. So in the current IDEs, you've got characters, you have to select characters at a time. Here you can just automatically grab a whole statement and it comes as one. You know, even if it's graphically wrapped onto 3 different lines, it's still just one entity. You can just drag it around. You don't have to worry about, you know, this display or selecting bits, missing bits out. We also get better error avoidance. So this is one of our key motivations because we're interested in education. We don't want people to be able to make complicated errors. The amount of time that beginners lose on messing up the semicolons, getting the curly brackets out of whack, their code is always horrifically indented. If you've ever seen a beginner have a go at it, it just ends up terrible. So, you know, we tried to work this out in the past with Java. We've got auto layout functions, you know, little hints when you make common mistakes. But ultimately, it seems like just the model is wrong. And when we change the model of how the program is represented, suddenly loads and loads of these errors just become not applicable. And so we think for education, it will be an advantage to have error avoidance, but also professionals. Nobody wants to make errors. You know, if you could avoid errors, but not sort of lose your flexibility and your power and your ease of entry, then we can all agree it's for the better. The question is just, you know, can we do that? Can we avoid the errors without making it sort of, you know, horribly unusable and sort of, you know, in your way? And we hope that we have managed to do that. And there's lots of opportunities for improved presentation. We keep thinking of them as we start working with this. Oh, you can make that, you know, you could add that information there, or you could sort of, you know, change the display. And so we hope that there'll be sort of more of these that we can discover. And that in general, as I say, once you choose the right model for your program code, there's just lots more scope for doing interesting things. Okay, so I'm going to hand back over to Michael, and we'll take questions if you have any.
We actually managed to stick in our time and leave 10 minutes for questions there. I don't know where to start. I'll start on the left and come over there. Yep.
Please tell me that there's something like this that somebody's working on for a plugin for Java or Eclipse or IntelliJ. I'd love such a thing.
I would love to see that. We don't know of anyone who is working on that, but that's why we're here. We try to seed the idea there, and maybe someone can start that. I agree. I would like to see that. I would like to use it because, of course, we don't program in our own system because it's a beginner system.
May I answer that question? There's the meta programming system by JetBrains, which has a projectional editor. You can use it for Java if you want to, or make your own language. So I'm not sure how that is related.
Okay, something to look at. Yes.
Do you think a generation of programmers starting with Scratch, which is very similar in terms of the frames and slots, will get more traction with this in years to come?
Yes, exactly. We haven't talked about that because it's not about education in this session here, but our motivation is very strongly driven by this. So we work in programming education in primary school systems like Scratch or Snap or Alice or Pencil Code. Or there's a whole lot of the block-based systems are very popular, very successful, fantastic systems. You know, 8-year-olds can program. But the transition to text is actually a fairly big step, and a lot of teachers are struggling, and a lot of students are struggling, and we think this may be the answer to go that in 2 steps, you know, in sort of smaller steps forward. Yes, very much so.
So I'm not exactly a Java beginner, but there are lots of languages, smaller languages that are more specific that I don't know yet. I'm learning like the Maven build system. How easy is it to adopt your IDE to a simpler syntax like what Maven offers or some other XML?
The principles of this editing style are applicable to any structured document. So you could just as well write an editor, a frame-based editor, for XML or for HTML or for, you know, for any kind of structured language. In terms of programming languages, there are some constructs that make it a bit harder than others. So, for example, in our language, we have not yet incorporated lambdas. There it becomes a bit more complicated because suddenly you can have, you know, method calls within expressions and the other way around, and you can nest it arbitrarily deeply, and it becomes, from the user interaction, a little bit more complicated. So not all languages are equal in the sense, you know, there are some constructs that may be more complicated, but certainly simple structured documents you can build a frame-based editor for. There's nothing stopping you. Yeah.
So, if I understand you right, these are a plugin or something you developed for the Greenfoot environment, or?
It's not a plugin. It's a part of the Greenfoot system now. So it's the editor in the Greenfoot system. Yes. Yep. Yep. Yes, that's right.
Okay, so that we cannot now linking the code representation to the IDE. So we are removing one constraint, but we are adding another one. As in, maybe in my team, one person wants to use one IDE, and a different person wants to use a different IDE. This kind of system could, but are you going to take steps in that direction?
Well, I mean, it is for team projects. It's a big change. This will not happen within a year or 2 years or 5 years, because this will affect the whole tool chain, because this affects how programs are stored, and so there is an interchange format between different tools. At the moment, that is ASCII stored in text files. All the tool builders would have to agree to use a common code storage structure, and that may be XML or something similar. But we think, that layout and presentation should be removed from the stored structure because it's not necessary there. But it will be a very long process because, any tool builder that touches the source code, your version repository, your whatever, would have to agree. So ideally, you need a whole tool chain that agrees on this alternative storage structure. And that is why it's not an easy change, to go down the whole tool stack in a professional environment. It is, if that catches on at all, it will take many years until sort of a full set of tools is available. But we think it's bound to be the direction things have to go. But
Can I just add something
Yeah.
to that? Is any of these microphones on? Is this one on? Okay. So I think it's not quite as bad as that, because if you imagine our languages to Java as CoffeeScript is to JavaScript, it's a sort of nicer thing on the front end, but we compile down to Java, and then from then on it's the Java toolchain. So we're JVM compatible with any other JVM library that's out there. So if you build one component in our language, you can just call Java libraries. You can have Java libraries call our components. So we're at least bytecode compatible, almost straight away. We would obviously you'd need to have, if you're editing that code, you'd both need to be using an editor capable of that language. We use XML as a storage format. But if you think about it, Java as a text language is, it is a commonly agreed format that a lot of tools support. You just need to have another IDE support, our particular XML structure. So they wouldn't be able to pick up their Java editor and edit our code. But if you had an editor in your IDE that, dealt with our language, then that would work fine. There have been similar projects that have tried to do a bidirectional mapping so that you'd actually be storing Java in this rather than XML. There's a couple of reasons why we don't do that, why it's just a bit better for us to not store the Java, but it is a different route that you could have an editor like this that stores Java. It gets really awkward if you've got a structural syntax error in your Java because that doesn't map back deliberately. But that's actually less of an issue in professional environments, because if you commit code with a structurally wrong syntax error, what are you doing? You should be committing at least code that parses and compiles and runs. Maybe it doesn't pass the tests or whatever. But it's pretty rare that you actually share between each other a syntax error. So that's not necessarily an issue. But in our particular instance, we've used XML and sort of gone for a different language. But the principles, I think, would apply, and potentially you could actually have even source code compatible between two different IDEs.
okay, we've got time for another couple of quick questions. Let's go over there.
What are your thoughts on source diff, frame diffs or like
Sorry?
comparing the code? Diff?
Well, we haven't got that built as a tool yet, so that's something that we can't show. But in principle, there is nothing stopping you coming up with a nice graphical representation of a diff. It's already in existing IDEs, even with text-based systems. There is that's actually one point where color is often used already, and some graphical annotation if you have it side by side and draws lines from this to this section. That is an area where there are ideas already out there. There's nothing in principle stopping you from doing it at least as well in this system. Yeah.
When you're dragging elements around, how do you deal with variable scope? So if you have a locally defined, a globally defined variable, you pull a element.
We ignore that. So that is a possible operation. So you can drag a variable out of scope. It's structurally still a valid syntax tree, and you're creating a type error, and that is just displayed as an error as if you had just typed it in. That is related to that we are not trying to be too over-restrictive. We have various places where we quite knowingly allow errors. For example, we also allow a call to a method that doesn't exist. So you can insert a method call and type a method that doesn't exist. We could easily prevent this, but I think it would get very annoying because sometimes you want to write a method call, I'm just going to write the implementation in a minute. And I don't want to be stopped from typing something because typically, I know what I'm doing. I don't want my IDE to stop me from doing this. And that comes down to a very fundamental point. Many of these ideas are not new. That has been tried before. In the late 80s, early 90s, if you're old enough, structure editors were a fashion for a few years. There was, a hype about structural editors were the answer to everything. This is a structured editor. This is a particular example of that idea. It failed spectacularly. People hated them and threw them away after a very short time because it was really annoying. You couldn't leave it. In fact, Visual Studio still has had that a few years ago. I think that's probably our time is up notification. I'll just finish my sentence and then we stop the session. I don't know where that noise actually comes from. Sometimes it didn't allow you to move the cursor out of your line when it had a syntax error in it, or something like this. This is if you just actually edit the syntax tree, you very quickly, if you're not careful, become very restrictive. And that is just annoying, if you do this. So we knowingly allow many errors just to get the edit flexibility back. We want this editor to feel flexible and fluid. We are out of time. We have to get out of the room. They're fairly strict with the time. We will stick around for a while. If you have questions, please come up to us and ask the questions. But we finish the session here. Thank you for coming.